Well, hello. We're back to discuss the first part of the book. We trust that you've been reading along and enjoying what really was a really great first part of this book. I felt that he really did just jump straight in there.
Very
with
much
both
so.
a challenge
Yep.
and
Practical, theory, scripture, application, all in the first part. You're like, okay.
very meaty few
Yeah.
chapters.
Yeah.
Any first thoughts on just that whole first part as a whole?
Absolutely. Like, I really appreciated that he hasn't spent the first few chapters with often very abstract thoughts and concepts of prayer. And I'm certainly not discounting the value in that. But for me, particularly, as someone who finds it easy to think about theory, but not necessarily easy to then put that into practice, the fact that right from the first chapter, he's like, here's your exercise, here's what you're going to do, here's how you're going to sit in this moment. And actually then trying that and doing that and pretty much failing exactly as he suggests you're going to. But then again, the encouragement is this is not a one-time thing. This is a long, it's a lifetime journey, really. Really got me early on. So I'm excited to sort of journey through the book and see how he builds even on just that early bit.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It was both a challenge to pray and an inspiration, I think. He really, the way he talks about God just inspires you to want to come close to this God that he talks about.
Yeah.
But that first chapter, labeled At His Feet, really is just about what the title is. He goes into unpacking the truth that above all that we do for God, looking at, the current culture, our fast-paced lives, put all that aside, the most important thing really is at his feet. An easy thing to know and agree with. Another thing entirely to put into practice, right?
You're exactly right. Yep, absolutely. He talks a lot. He starts with the story of Mary and Martha. And I, having read that story so many times, always thought Martha got so hard done by.
I know.
Just thinking, that's great that Mary sort of sat there and just soaked in Jesus. But someone's got to make the sandwiches,
right?
Don't they? You've got a whole crowd of people in your home, potentially unexpectedly. And I just always identified with Martha and thought that would be exactly me. And he has this amazing line, you're a Martha when all you see is other people being Mary at the foot of Jesus. And I went, ouch. It was a massive ouch. The super encouraging bit though about that is that he then also talks about it's not Mary and Martha, like it's not Mary without Martha, it's Mary before Martha. It's choosing the good thing first, and out of that everything else flows. And I mean, that's the first time I think I've ever really explicitly thought about that along those lines, because it has always just seemed like this binary choice. You're either Mary or you're Martha. You're either the prodigal son or you're the good son who stayed at home and looked after the cows and was responsible, oldest child. And now suddenly youngest son waltzes back in and there's dad being, oh, how fantastic. Let's give you everything. And, obviously you can see that my spiritual journey, having really then gone, the Martha and the eldest son, that's so much of what I've struggled with. And so seeing that it's not a criticism, but rather it's an invitation.
Yeah, I love that.
It's an invitation to actually let go of all this other stuff that you feel like, yes, more Bluey. Sorry,
She's back.
I have an accompaniment again. It's not a criticism of the need to do things or the fact that life has all of these other things. It's actually an invitation to sort of set those aside and to not have that guilt around I should be doing this other thing. So that was absolutely beautiful for me.
Yeah, beautifully said. And I relate personally. Oldest child as well. So I'm with you. Yes.
Someone had to look after the cows.
Someone does, and someone needs to make the sandwiches.
Yeah, they really do.
Yeah, get the kids to school, all the things. Someone's got to do it.
Someone does have to do it.
So that second chapter then, which actually was, I found it out of the three my favourite.
Yeah, okay.
I really liked this second chapter, and it was called In the Wilderness. And what I liked about it, I think that word wilderness gets bantered around a lot in church, you know, and it's usually around the difficult time or the season of struggle, confusion, question, which it absolutely is. But I'd never quite heard it spoken of the way
No.
he speaks of it. And he speaks of it as, you know, living this intentional life of being dependent upon God.
Yep.
Upon, you know, making those choices to not rely on those things that we gather around to prop us up and to comfort us and to fuel. You know, he's talking about letting go of those things, which is a risky thing, and choosing. And he uses the illustration of John the Baptist to just live the life that is completely dependent upon him.
Yep.
I loved that.
Oh, absolutely. Exactly as you said, we often think of the wilderness as this transitional phase. If I spend hopefully a small amount of time in the wilderness being formed, then at some point I will emerge from the wilderness fully formed and ready to step into the glory that will undoubtedly be my life.
Yeah.
And, you know, reading John the Baptist, you know, the story of the announcement of his birth and Gabriel appearing to Zacharias and saying, this is the one who was prophesied in Isaiah. He's going to make straight the pathway for the Lord. And you just think, wow, what an incredible story. And then there's some really uncool stuff about not drinking wine and not having a wife and having to eat locusts and wearing camel hair. And you just think, yeah, all right.
Yeah, that's stripping back, that is.
There's a bit of a strippy back there. And actually, in reading the story, John the Baptist doesn't go into the wilderness, spend some time with God, and then come out of it, and now here's this incredible ministry. John the Baptist's whole ministry and life is the wilderness. And the way that Corey talks about it is saying he spent 26 years devouring the Word of God, alone with his thoughts and with God, alone with the scriptures. And it was really out of that then he starts to minister and people come to the wilderness to find him. And Corey has this phenomenal line in the book, which is that voices do not graduate from the wilderness. And oh my goodness, that I just found that incredibly challenging, but also incredibly encouraging. It's not a season, you know, on the way to something better.
Absolutely.
It's the story of life. I went to a lecture years ago by a guy named Charles Ringmer, who is essentially a modern day hermit. So for 6 months of the year, he will spend in a hermitage alone contemplating.
So a hermitage is a place that you actually go to?
Yeah. As it turns out, there are things called hermitage. I mean, it potentially is just an Airbnb out the back of somewhere else. So he's also a Bible college lecturer and he works in the slums of the Philippines. So, you know, a really incredibly practically directed life. But he had this beautiful line about the blessedness of the everyday and the idea of living a life, but a small life, well. And I think it's super easy to get into this slipstream of I'm supposed to be a generation changer, I'm supposed to be a world changer and a shaker, and my life is going to have these incredible ripples that just traverse out and change all of history. And that's absolutely true for some people, and I'm certainly not suggesting you should all dial your vision down a bit. But I also think then sometimes we miss the good part that Mary chose, going back to that first chapter of just sitting at Jesus's feet and letting that translate into the everyday. Because let's be practical, you can't stop life. You can't stop the sandwich making and the toddler who wants more bluey and the school run and you know, the work and the study. You can't make it go away, but you can choose still to find Jesus in the midst of all of that. So that I thought was fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that whole thing of, you know, our culture wanting to get a message, to read more, like you say, go to the wilderness and emerge with a message.
Yes.
This just really, you know, breaks all that down and is like, well, is your life a message?
Yeah.
Because in the wilderness and living dependent on God, it's not a message that I have in my mouth. It's a message with my life. Living my small life or my large life, whatever it is, it's living my life as a message. Which is amazing.
It's incredible.
So encouraging. All right, the third chapter. Teach us to pray. He jumps right in there, unpacking, you know, the Lord's Prayer as we know it. And interestingly enough, I'd never heard that kind of teaching with the parable directly after it tacked on
that's
to the
right.
end.
No, and that's exactly right, because you read it often in Matthew as part of the Sermon on the Mount, but it's only in Luke that it actually gets the parable at the end, and you realize, oh wow, like it's a really interesting metaphor, the idea of so it's the story of the really annoying neighbor who shows up at midnight going, I need bread. And you say, well, I don't have any bread. And he's like, well, I need bread. So you go along to the next door neighbor's house and you bang on the door and he says, go away, there's no bread. And you bang and you bang and you bang. And eventually the neighbor comes down and I'm like, I'll give you bread, but not because I'm your friend, but because you need it and your persistence won me over.
Go away. I want to go back to bed.
Yeah. And that's just extraordinary, this image of God giving us what we seek and ask and knock for, not out of some misguided concept of friendship and, you know, the vending machine idea, but this response to hunger, this response to persistence. Oh,
yeah. And really that's what is driven home in that chapter, that persistence. And he actually uses, which I don't know, kind of ruffles my feathers a bit. He likens persistence in prayer with the furnace.
Yeah.
And how sometimes we are so tempted, like we all are, right? In prayer, you hit the distraction point.
100%.
And let's be honest, sometimes the boredom point, you know, like you're sitting there and you feel like your prayers are just hitting the ceiling. But he talks about, you know, not pulling away in that moment, but staying.
Yeah.
Staying in the furnace, because it's in that place that we're transformed.
Yeah.
And it's really quite powerful.
I think so. And practically there's often this space of you just need to let all those thoughts come and go and just sit there. So he has this kind of beautiful structure of you sit there and initially you don't know what to say, and then you kind of do the checklist thing. God, here's all the things I need. And then it's, as you say, like it's the boredom, and then there's the shame and the guilt, and then there's the rawness and the vulnerability. And he says, just let all that come, because if you can just sit in that space, eventually you'll move past it and you will actually behold God and see his face. And it's not that he wasn't there the whole time, but it is just allowing all of those kind of filters and those veils to pass by. I loved how he was talking about we actually need a revelation of who God is. So he has these questions like, who do you think God is? Who do you feel God to be? C.S. Lewis has this lovely line, and I'll open it rather than making it up so I can quote it verbatim. And it's from the Screwtape Letters, and it's where the master teacher demon is writing to the apprentice demon Wormwood, and he says this about the subject. So the job is to try and distract him from his prayers, but more than that. And he says, for if he, the subject, ever comes to make the distinction, if he ever consciously directs his prayers not to what I think thou art, but to what thou knowest thyself to be, our situation is for the moment desperate. Once all his thoughts and images have been flung aside, or, if retained with a full recognition of their merely subjective nature, and the man trusts himself to the completely real, external, invisible presence there with him in the room, and never knowable by him as he is known by it, why, it is then that the incalculable may occur.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was, it so encapsulates this idea of, if we can sit with God for long enough, all of our subjective bundle of thoughts about who we think he is and what we need him to be and how we're hoping he'll meet our needs, all of that kind of slowly filters away, and we're just left with this raw encounter of the living creator. So I just thought Corey had encapsulated that. So, C.S. Lewis has a line for everything, which is really helpful. If you're ever doing anything, just I'm sure C.S. Lewis will have a useful quote to pop in
point you in the right direction.
That's right.
That's so powerful. Yeah, no, I love that. The quote that Corey, you know, from the book that really spoke to me, which is, you know, very much the same. He says it's where talking about this furnace, that staying, that lingering, pushing past all those things like you just beautifully said. You know, he said it's where we're forged in the fire of delayed promises. We are delivered from fantasies of grandeur and are conformed into the image of the Son. And it's beautiful. Staying. And I think that's where we can encourage one another.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
because we've all been there where we've wanted to tap out of prayer. And, you know, I think being honest about that. And you made reference to that in our very first video. Like, it's beautiful to just own it and be like, hey, I'm struggling. But encouraging one another to stick with it.
And I think it's probably like anything in the sense that it's a practice. So I've been using the fact that I have quite a long commute to sort of be in this space of going, well, look, there's really nothing else going on, so I'll just switch everything off and I'm just going to sit. And I'm terrible at it. It's so hard to quarantine your mind from all of the thoughts that immediately want to invade. But this book is incredibly practical in saying, just let that come, let that happen, trust that it will flow away. And so that's, at the moment, what I'm practicing is just
that's awesome. I was going to ask you that, like what practical aspects have you been, you know, encouraged to try, or and so silence in the car,
because I find silence really tricky. And he's great. Like, he talks about make it a consistent time. So actually make a practice,
Yeah.
set a time, sit down with your Bible
Yeah.
and, notepad and pen and just be in the moment. Because I'm great at sort of sitting in the worship space.
Yeah.
That's brilliant, but I'll just sing along or enjoy the music. So actually having nothing, no other inputs, and just sitting in that moment. Yeah. So I'm going to keep practicing that.
Ah, awesome. I'm excited to hear how that transpires.
Yeah,
in the
me
coming
too.
months.
Me too. Hopefully it will move just beyond I really should get milk.
I love that.
Oh, it's always milk.
Oh, well, thanks, Sian. Always insightful. Thanks,
Thank
Pippa.
you. That's very helpful.
And we trust that, you're getting or have gotten just as much out of these first 3 chapters as what we have.
Yeah.
And I love that you shared that practicality of what you're trying. We would actually love to hear from you. If you have put new things into practice, you're, trying out for the first time different practices in order to expand and press in different ways to your prayer life. We would love to hear about that. So underneath this video, I've actually popped a link there for you to share your experiences. What are your difficulties, but also what are your wins? Because we're all in this together.
Yeah.
And we'd really like to be encouraging one another as we dig into prayer.
Yeah.
And there'll also be a link there, of course, for some more discussion questions to help you dig into these first 3 chapters.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, and we'll see you again soon. And we're praying for you as
Yeah.
well as you dig deeper into prayer.